Chapter 2. When Mrs. Crimmins Comes to Fetch You. When Mrs. Crimmins comes to fetch you, my mother says, your days in this room will be over. You will never return. I've lived here for a long, long time, and have had many more children than just the 5 of you. And if there's one thing I've learned by now, it is this. When Mrs. Crimmins comes with her cardboard box to take my children away, she takes them away for good. The memory of her other children filled my mother's eyes with tears. To gain a little time to recover her composure, she turned and took a sip or two of water from the dish. But that is exactly as it should be, she went on. When the proper moment comes, every young mouse will leave home and go out into the world to pursue his destiny. One day, Mrs. Crimmins will take you away. She will carry you off and sell you, either to a pet shop or a medical laboratory, for she is in the business of raising and selling white mice. Is it better to go to a pet shop? One of my brothers asked, or to a medical laboratory? It's much better to go to a pet shop, my mother said. You aren't likely to stay there long. Before you know it, someone will come and buy you, and then you'll go home with your new owner. These days, my mother continued, we white mice are considered very good pets. People love us for our energy and our antics, our pink noses, our soft fur, our curiosity, and what some foolish souls think are reputed to call our cuddlesomeness. We are said to have winning ways, and accordingly, we are generally well treated. Therefore, though happiness is often only a matter of blind luck, I think it's safe to say that each of you will probably find a great joy with the person who buys you for a pet and takes you home with him to live. My sister, Anna, glanced in my direction before she said, must each of us go to a different home? Or could 2 of us have the same owner and live together in this house for the rest of our lives? I'm not so sure about that, my mother replied. I think most people buy only 1 mouse at a time. At least I've heard Mrs. Crimmins complain that owners don't buy enough of her white mice. So that's the conclusion I've come to. On the other hand, there must be times when somebody decides to buy 2 white mice so they can live together and keep each other company. Yes, I suppose there's a good chance you and one of your brothers might end up in the same house, living together as you did here. Judging from her expression, I knew this answer pleased my sister, and at first it had the same effect on me. And then I fell into thinking, perhaps my mother simply had forgotten it. But what about the other possibility? Suppose one didn't go to the pet shop. Suppose instead it was something I had to know. What happens, I asked, if we are taken to a medical laboratory? Would people come and buy us there too? My mother looked at me reproachfully, as though she wished I hadn't brought the matter up. Yet she did not hesitate. No, she answered. When a white mouse goes into a medical laboratory, he remains there all his days. And the laboratory is the only owner he ever has. Does something bad happen to you there? Sometimes. By no means always, though. Probably half the white mice in laboratories live splendid lives. They have plenty of companions, good food, and many diversions to keep them occupied. And the other half? They are made subjects of medical experiments, my mother says. I'm not entirely certain what that means, for Mrs. Crimmins seldom had talked about it within my hearing, but I'm afraid that whatever it is, you are better off avoiding it. I think it must be the worst thing that can happen to a white mouse, next to having a wicked owner who mistreats you. Our curiosity had been satisfied, and it wasn't long before the 5 of us returned to our usual activities. To all appearances, nothing had changed. We played once more among the paper shavings. We gnawed on bits of cheese and lettuce. We talked, explored, and kept busy as before. In reality, though, things were different now. An uncertain future hung over us like a cloud. My brothers put up a bold front. "No, indeed," one of them declared. "I'm not going to any medical laboratory. It's a pet shop and only a pet shop for me. And then a rich old man will come along and buy me, and after that I'll have a comfortable home and no end of salted nuts to eat for the rest of my life." He grinned and swaggered about, and the other two soon joined him. They took turns boasting of the good luck they expected to have between Mrs. Crimmins. They took turns boasting of the good luck they expected to have when Mrs. Crimmins came to fetch them. But beneath their bold talk and laughter, they were as frightened of the future as I was myself. I discovered that Anna feared the likelihood of our being separated from each other. "Do you think," she asked me one night, "that somebody might buy both of us so that we could stay together instead of going to different homes?" "I think it's very likely," I replied, "but I'm not at all certain what will happen to the others. But this much I do feel sure of. Somehow, you and I will always manage to remain together." "I hope so," she said, "because you are the dearest to me of my brothers. I think my heart would break, Christopher, if we were to be parted and I had to say goodbye to you for the last time." "That will never happen," I told her. "You'll see. We just need to have a little luck, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have it." While awaiting the day of our departure, the five of us did not remain idle. One morning my mother announced that we were old enough to begin our schooling. "By the time I was your age," she told us, "I was studying my lessons so that I wouldn't leave home unprepared. My mother tried to teach me as much as she could about the world. Every mouse wants to do that for her children, and I can do no less for you." She told us stories about her early life before she had to come stay with Mrs. Crimmins. She encouraged us to ask questions when we didn't understand and was remarkably patient with us as long as we remained alert. If our attention wandered, though, we ran the risk of a sharp nip in the tail or a hard nudge in the ribs. Besides telling us stories, she taught us to use the daily papers. Every other afternoon, Mrs. Crimmins placed some clean pages of the New York Times or the Post on the floor of our cage. As soon as she left, my mother scurried around examining columns of print, pictures, captions, and advertisements to see what interesting facts they might contain. "Anything in a newspaper," she informed us, "can be grist for a mouse's mill." At first she read the items aloud. There were stories about cars and airplanes, typhoons and hurricanes, baseball and football games, stray dogs and cats and other lost pets, and the arrival of the circus in town. Under her guidance, we began to learn how to read for ourselves using the huge letters in the advertisements. It wasn't long before we were familiar with the price of men's and women's clothing, the casts of the latest movies and plays, and the extraordinary bargains to be obtained at the Broadway restaurant that offered all the steak you can eat for $12.95. As our skills increased, we took to reading the small print as well. Soon my brothers and I were devouring the sports pages, the comics, and any items about soldiers or space travel that we could find. In this way, 2 or 3 weeks went by. Late one afternoon, Mrs. Crimmins came and slid back the trap door. One by one, she seized each of my 3 brothers, hauled by kicking and struggling out of our cage, and dropped him into a shoebox, the sides of which were punctured with air holes. Anna and I huddled away in a corner, certain that it would be our turn next. Instead, Mrs. Crimmins said, "Three's enough for today," and slid the trap door shut. It made its usual hideous noise, this time drowning out our cries of farewell. That night Anna and I did little ease but wonder about our destination. The next day when Mrs. Crimmins brought us food and water, we heard her grumbling to herself. "That medical laboratory is a nerve. What do they think I'm doing here, raising white mice for the fun of it?" Thus my sister and I learned about the others, that they had not gone to a pet shop as they hoped, but to a medical laboratory. My mother, of course, had heard Mrs. Crimmins too, and for several hours she ran frantically back and forth inside our cage, scarcely able to restrain her anguish or conceal her tears.